Director of MedStar Emergency Medical Retrieval, South Australian State Controller for Health and Medical, Clinical Associate Professor for the Adelaide University, and Associate Professor at James Cook University. Regional Ambulance Service Medical Officer with St John, South Australian Ambulance Service. Royal Australian Air Force, Director of Air Force Health Reserves, South Australia, Western Australia. St John Ambulance Australia Operations Branch, Medical Officer. And Board Member, Phoenix Society, Prince Alfred College and SUFA SA. Believe it or not, he's actually got interest in hobbies. Spending time with his family, computers, reading, chess, photography, genealogy, cycling. Tells me he did 14,000 kilometres on his bike last year. And he has a private flying licence, pilot's licence. And he's an honorary Rotarian of Adelaide South. We were too late. I actually had the pleasure of meeting Bill and working with him 30 years ago when we were both serving as ambulance officer volunteers with St John Ambulance Brigade. I've worked in the radio room and on ambulances with him and seen him work in intensive care and retrievals. A leading authority in emergency medicine, please welcome an exceptional South Australian, Dr. Bill Griggs.
I started wondering if I could do any of the jobs properly. I'm looking at so many. Maybe that's the issue. Thank you very much. Please keep eating and etc. I'm going to talk to you today about an event I was involved in 2009. In 2009 in September there was an earthquake and a tsunami in Samoa. Well, it affected Samoa, it also affected Tonga and a couple of other islands in the Pacific. On the day of the earthquake, the High Commission, the Australian High Commission, which is up here quite close to the coast, has a strategy when there's an earthquake, which is basically run away, go up the hills in case there is a tsunami. They met at a compound up the hill and we all stood around waiting to see what happened. Everything looked okay. And they thought they would start to do some checking around the island. They had a number of local people that worked for them. When they started ringing contacts on the south coast, they had trouble getting through. And the ones that they could get through were saying that there had been a tsunami, there had been people injured and killed, but it was very unclear what was going on. I was in Adelaide. I was at a state disaster exercise in the city. It was a tabletop exercise in a room not dissimilar to this, with a similar number of people going through a fictitious exercise and working out how we would deal with it. There was a message that there was going to be a teleconference at 2:30 that afternoon to talk about what had happened in Samoa. And the Australian Health Protection Committee, which is a federal government organised entity, has representatives in each of the states, and we got together and had a teleconference. And the upshot of that was really just watch this space. There's been an earthquake and we think there's been a tsunami. We're not sure what the injuries are, if any, but can the various different jurisdictions, states and territories just have a think about who they might have available perhaps to go in the next 24 hours or so to maybe do an assessment, to do what's called an initial assessment run, just maybe 2 or 3 people. And then consider whether they might have the availability to provide teams, if required, over the next 2 or 3 days, to leave over the next 2 or 3 days. And there'd be another update teleconference at 6 o'clock that evening, but we don't expect there to be any change. So we went back to the disaster exercise. We did a little bit of planning as to what might happen. It's always good to do. And then we had the 6 o'clock teleconference. What had happened is the High Commissioner had managed to get through to the Minister of Foreign Affairs and explain that things were not good. It's still a bit unclear, but as often happens, it got to the Prime Minister, who said, we need to send someone and we need to send someone now. So the 6 o'clock teleconference started with, it's all just changed. As of 5 minutes ago, we need teams to go, and there's a plane that will be leaving Brisbane Airport at 1 o'clock in the morning, so you've got 7 hours to be in Brisbane Airport. So we'll just go around the state. Queensland, what can you do? We think we can put 4 or 5 people together by then, but we really haven't started anything, so we'll do what we can. Sydney, what can you do? Can't make that timeline. Melbourne, what can you do? Can't make that timeline. Adelaide, what can you do? Now, because I'd asked the other ones first, I've been frantically Googling away and looking at websites, and saw that there was a Jetstar flight that left Adelaide at 8:40, so that was 2 hours and 40 minutes away. We could get into Brisbane at 11 o'clock in the evening, and that theoretically would get us on the 1 o'clock plane out of the international flight. So I said, yep, we can provide a team. How many can you provide? There were a couple of us there. I'd gone on the phone to Jetstar and said, how many seats have you got on the flight? And they said 12. I said, we can provide a team of 12. We actually hadn't identified anyone at that stage. And they said, oh, that's good, okay, all right, Adelaide, South Australia, down for 12. And then there was a bit more discussion. So we jumped on the phone, myself and another guy, and we started ringing people saying, hello, how'd you like to go to Samoa now? And the last guy that we got, Rob Atkinson, Rob's a surgeon, orthopaedic surgeon at Lottery. Rob went to the Vietnam War, he'd been around for a while, went to the first Gulf War, which was my first military deployment. He looked after me then. I rang Rob and said, hey Rob, it's Bill, something's on. You available to go to Samoa? And he said, when? I said, well, now. It's now 7:15 and you don't have to be at the airport until 7:30. Well, 7:40 really, you've got an hour beforehand, so you've got 55 minutes and you're at Mobley Hospital. Can I ring? He says, can I ring my wife? I said, no time for that. I said, if I can't get you, I've got to keep going on the phone, and I've actually got to get home myself and start getting organised. So he made a decision and said, I'm sure Pauline will understand. I said, I'll be in. So we got 12 people together, and we managed to get to Brisbane. And when we had a couple of surgeons, a couple of anaesthetists, some emergency medicine people, some nurses, some paramedics. When we got to Brisbane, we met a group of Queensland people. There were a dozen of them as well. And their team leader is a guy that I know quite well. And on the plane on the way over to Samoa, we sort of sat with each other and sort of worked out what resources we had, and decided it would made much more sense to have one team of 24 and to have a surgical capacity, an emergency medicine capacity, a logistics capacity, to mix the groups up. So we did all of that. We landed in Samoa at what was effectively 5 o'clock in the morning Adelaide time. So that was 11 hours after we'd sort of had the initial sort of go thing, and we've been going pretty flat out since then. And immediately we got sent to the local hospital and were given a bit of a briefing about what happened. The local hospital was pretty well overwhelmed. They had set up a special tsunami ward, which is in fact an old children's ward. There's lots of children's paintings and things on the wall when it was overflowing. So we got sent there to do a ward round there. One of the things we noticed is that there are quite a few foreign nationals there, a number of Australians, Kiwis, there were 4 Germans, some British people, and as well as a lot of locals. We sent 2 paramedics out down to the south coast to have a look at what was happening down there, because that was still a bit unclear, well, a lot unclear. And we did our initial assessment and went back to the High Commission and basically said, well, we've got a group of things that we need to do. We've really got 5 main problems. The first one was that we need to start the surgeons who had been operating on patients in the local hospital. We were about to fall over because they've been going for 24 hours, and the operating theatre people were struggling. So we added our Queensland and South Australian doctors and nurses into that group, and they had 3 operating theatres but only enough staff for 1. So between us we could run all 3. And what we did was we made sure that in each operating theatre there were South Australian, Queensland and Samoan people. It wasn't like a Samoan team, a Queensland team, a South Australian team, mix them all together. And that's quite important, so you need to use the local people as much as you can. So the surgeons basically put Rob in charge of that. to work out the logistics. They worked out the priorities of who needed what further surgery and started that process happening over the next number of days. The next thing we needed to do was support the emergency department. They had a few local people. They had a couple of medical students who were on electives over there who were helping to work, some others who were on holidays who'd come in to try and help two doctors from New Zealand, general practitioners who were helping. And we put a number of people in there, including a couple of people who had quite good experience from the tsunami and the tsunami-style injuries from Banda Aceh. And Hugh Grantham, who was the Chief Medical Officer of the Ambulance Service, who led Team Echo in Banda Aceh, we put Hugh in charge of that. We needed to sort out what was going out in the field, so we sent 2 paramedics out to try and get some information, along with some Queensland fire and rescue people, to see what we could do. And the other thing we had to do was we had to work out what to do about the foreign nationals. As we've gone around in the first ward round, one of the things I've done, and I hadn't realised until later how important this was, is each time I met an Australian or a Kiwi or a person who didn't live in Samoa, I gave them one of my business cards, because they'd been through a very bad experience, and suddenly here was the help that they were waiting for, except I was saying, hello, we're here to help, but bye now, I'll be back. And by the way, just to trust me, I will be back, here's who I really am. And it was interesting that when we did come back to see them later on, you'd often find them actually clutching the card in their hands as a sort of talisman. We made a decision to try and evacuate as many of the foreign nationals as we could on that first day. And there were some interesting comments, including from a couple of people within our team, as to, you know, is that the right thing to do? Are we preferentially treating the people because they're Australians by flying them back to Australia versus the Samoans? But the reality is that if you looked at that ward and the other wards in the hospital, the local Samoans had been injured and they'd been taken to the facility which was the best facility that they had in the country. And they were actually quite comfortable and happy to be there. The Australians, the Kiwis, the Germans, the British, they had been taken to what they perceived as very much a third world facility and not what they expected. They were a long way from home. When you're in pain, when you're suffering, when you're scared, I think you want to be as close to home as possible. So what it meant was that group of foreign nationals, which was probably a third of the patients in the ward, was taking up 90% of the nursing time because they were so stressed. The other thing is that if you want to look after people, you need to look after them physically, but you also need to look after them psychologically. And one of the things psychologically is you need to make people feel safe. And the reality was that these people were not really going to feel safe until we could get them back to the place they wanted to be. And so we spoke back to Australia. The Air Force had organised a couple of aircraft. There was a C-17 coming across that afternoon, evening, and they had 2 paramedical teams on board. We did have some challenges in how to get the patients to the airport, just about 10 kilometres away from the hospital, because there were no ambulances. And at least one of the patients we had to move had very severe lacerations in their leg, in his legs, and was unable to bend at the waist or at the knee. But again, you sort of MacGyver up a solution, and we sent the paramedics come back from the south coast out into the car park, and they identified a car that had seats that lay flat. It was a station wagon. We found it belonged to one of the people in the High Commission. We're just going to borrow your car. It's going to be our ambulance. And it'll help us get one of the patients out to the airport. So we managed to get all the patients out to the airport. We managed to get them, all the Australians evacuated on that first flight, and the British as well. The Kiwis we organised for a plane from New Zealand, which was going to come in the next morning to get them, and we were left with the 4 Germans. And the difficulty with that is that none of them had Australian visas. The Australian government has no responsibility for German nationals, but clearly they wanted to get somewhere safe as well. I had a long chat with the High Commissioner about it, and basically we wrote a document which said that we thought it was in their medical best interest for that to happen. That went through the German High Commission, back through to Germany, across to Australia, came back, and we got permission the next day to evacuate them as well. That sort of over that first 2 days, then assessment, then the surgery, ongoing, the emergency department support, because people were still coming in, and the aeromedical evacuations. A lot of other things we did, we were sending situation reports back 2 or 3 times a day. We'd taken 2 people who were logisticians who were very good at finding accommodation, various things for us. So we finished at the airport about 2 a.m. that first night, morning or second morning by that stage, and they'd organised some accommodation, found a hotel in Uphill, which was fine. There were sort of 4 of us to a room, which was only meant to be 2, so a couple of people on the floor, so I sort of snuck back and slept on the floor for a while and then got up when we started again. That went on for the first 2 days. The third day, or the evening of the second day, we had a meeting at the High Commission, and the High Commissioner said that he'd been approached by the senior people in the Samoan government saying that there was a village that was missing, a village called Saliopaga, which was on the south coast, which had basically been completely destroyed by the tsunami. And there were a number of bodies and debris where the village used to be, and the report was that all the people who survived had basically got up and walked inland. And there were supposedly a number of people injured, but no one had been able to find them. So we had a task to go and look for the village, as well as also go and check out some other things on the south coast, make sure there were no other major issues. To cut a long story short, we went and visited a number of places on the south coast, and we did find the village, and we found some people who were quite badly injured, and we managed to get them evacuated back to the hospital. At about that stage, the people from Queensland, from New South Wales and Victoria, the teams came in behind us. They'd had a bit more time to get organised than we had. Our initial instruction was to do the initial assessment. They sent the bigger teams in. Our guys have been going sort of flat out since they left, so we sort of handed over to them, had a couple of days of handover and takeover, and then we jumped on the plane and headed home. So it was an interesting event. The advantages of integrating with the locals was very important. There's a whole stack of messages and lessons there. The decision by the Australian High Commissioner very early on the basis of really fairly soft information to go back through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade to the Minister and say, look, we've actually got a big problem here, because there were many people who had been killed, many Australians who were injured and killed, as well as locals, and we basically got activated on the grounds of we're not really sure what's going on, but it sounds like a good idea, and as it turned out, it was a very good idea. I'm coming up towards 10 to 2, so I'll actually stop there, but I'm happy to answer questions about this deployment or any of a number of the other ones that I've done over the years. I just had to pick one. I thought I'd pick one that I hadn't spoken to people in the room about. It's difficult when you're speaking to lots of different places. Sometimes people have heard the same story before, but probably not this one. And there's lots of other bits to it. The presentation I was going to use is a cut-down version of one that can go for 1 or 2 hours. But unfortunately, you didn't say that. So I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone's got any.
Bill, thanks very much for that very insightful perspective. How long can first responders like your teams last before they need relief?
Sure, as long as necessary is the short answer. So when I went to Banda Aceh, we left Australia. I left home on the understanding we were going to Thailand to pick up injured Australians and bring them back. And at Darwin Airport they said, no, turn left and go to Medan. And my response was, where's that? It's in Indonesia, Sumatra. There's a problem in Banda. So I ended up being in Banda for probably 3.5 weeks. As more and more people came over the top, you do less and less, but there was a 6-day period there where I was getting between 1 and 2 hours sleep a day. You know that others are coming, so you just do what you need to. And the reality is, it's just hard enough. You look at what the local people have been through, what they've suffered. A bit of sleep deprivation for a while, provided you can function. I'm physiologically or genetically fortunate. I seem to be able to cope with less hours sleep than a lot of people might, certainly less than my wife thinks is optimal. So I'm one of the cycling things I'm doing at the moment. I'm having some coaching. I have to record how many hours sleep I get every night, and I seem to get between 4 and 5 hours most nights. I must admit I do feel better if I get 7 or 8.
But what would you plan on?
Oh, 3 days. 3 days is what we try and do. So if you're one of those early responders, if you've got to go out the door within an hour or 2 hours or 6 hours of being notified, you really don't have your chance to get anything organised. You have to have all your vaccinations lined up beforehand. You know, one of the things I did was ring my wife and say, I'm going to Samoa, can you grab the bag that's got not the military bag, the other bag? Because I need to grab that when I get home, because I was home for like 15 minutes. So if you're not prepared and ready to go, and so I, keep $1,000 US in the safe, because they'll work everywhere. And you can't, how do I pay for the airline ticket for 12 people to get to Jetstar? I put it on my own credit card, because it was actually just too hard to do anything through help. I eventually got the money back. It took me a year, but I got it. You do what you need to do, but the idea is just for 2 or 3 days, the initial assessment people, and then you get people over the top. And the initial stuff is meant to be an assessment, not so much treatment, because that's the stuff that you need. Oh, Tony. That's it.
What's the level of confidence in the integration of multicultural teams working on a major project like that, or the Indonesians and Army? They all come from different angles, think different ways. How well does that integration happen now that we've had a number of these over again?
I think that the issue with integration is that you need to understand that we are going into someone else's country. It's their country and their standards that we need to be comfortable with. And we need to be there to help them, not to take over from them. It's not stand aside, we're here now, it's all right, you can all relax, I've arrived. It's not like that. It's what can we do to help you with your problems. These are the resources we've got, we can do this, we can do that. What would you like us to do? Because that's what we would expect if someone came in with us. And if your mindset is not such that you are willing to deal with a system that works in a different way with perhaps some different standards, then it's probably not the right thing for you to do. Because those relationships are really important. It's about trying to fill a gap initially and then work with the locals as they sort of get back up to speed. And they're helping you, and then after a while it's actually you're helping them, and then eventually you can walk away and they're functioning. So teaching them and taking the opportunity to help them rather than just trying to take over is really important.
Yes, Bill. Do you and your medical team and other medical teams, do you have kits already made up so you sort of can grab the kits and off you go?
So the recent Philippine super typhoon thing, they took a whole field hospital. Now there are 2 or 3 of those around Australia. There isn't one in South Australia, there doesn't need to be one everywhere. We have some gear. We certainly have our personal gear, so we'll go and be self-sufficient, so we've got food and water and shelter. But we have only a limited amount of medical gear that we might take with us because we would expect that if somebody's going to need a complete field hospital, or either be a military one or one of the civilian ones going from one of the other states. And it's all meant to be integrated together.
Bill, thank you. The word pictures you painted were terrific. But I want to take you back to another part of your life, helicopter retrieval. And members may be surprised to know that I once aspired to be one of those people dangling from the wire. I failed the height test. but I think a lot of people in the room would really love you to paint a picture or a mental picture of what it's like to go up off the roof of the hospital, go out, do that trauma stuff, but have the added sensual implosion from being in a helicopter at height and then dangling on a wire.
Yeah, I'm scared of heights. I'm scared of a number of things. The way I deal with being scared of things is I go and try and beat my head against it for a while. So it's not hanging out of the helicopter on the wire. I've winched onto a ship. I've winched onto seven ship rescues. The most interesting one was 100 nautical miles out to sea southwest of Coffin Bay in a storm where we winched down onto a ship and the police officer went down first, I went down second, and the pilot refused to put the paramedic down after putting me down because it was too dangerous. I had one of my orthopaedic surgeon colleagues operate on my knee after that. We got a Scottish captain who was the only English-speaking person on the ship, unfortunately, who was unconscious with a bleeding to his brain and vomited and had abdominal through his lungs. the police officer how to be my sort of paramedic nurse assistants while we put him on life support, and then worked out, well, we've got a cylinder that's got 40 minutes oxygen, and somehow I've got to get him off the ship in 40 minutes, and we've got to go down 3 ladders. And so there are challenges. You get to work with wonderful people. When we winched up off the ship, I went up with a stretcher, and there was a problem with the skids. Got to the skids, was on the skids, leaning back, holding the stretcher, having got over the skids, which is a challenge in itself, because you come under them and you've got to sort of get yourself around them. And I had eye contact with Mark, who was doing the winch, and I suddenly just started to drop. And it was only about 6 months after a friend of mine in Melbourne and Sydney had been, the cable had been cut during a training exercise. He'd been dropped from 40 feet and sustained multiple injuries and nearly died. And I remember thinking, I run away, the cable's gone. And the second one I thought I was anchored, because I think I'm hooked onto this, and this is hooked onto the stretcher, which is made of steel, and we're just going to hit the water and keep going. So I actually tried to kick my feet out from the skids and try and sort of catch myself on the back of my knees, sort of hang upside down from the skids. You know, it's a little bit silly really when you don't think these things through. You might remember I said my knee was a bit sore. Well, it got even sore because this actually landed on my knee, at which stage the cable stopped running out, and Mark wheeled me back in, and we had a brief discussion about what was that all about. So there have been some entertaining, interesting times. You bond with the people that you go out with. You get to do some things that are unusual and interesting and challenging, and bring your adrenaline up occasionally. Yeah, I'm happy to hang around and talk to people. I do understand about rotary and the time constraints people are on, so I'm more than happy to hang around afterwards and talk to people individually to allow those people who need to go to get away.
One more question over here, I think. Last one.
Thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I was myself an area medical officer. Do you have any arrangements to take Air Force or other medical officers on some of these expeditions, or simply to give them experience?
I've been in the Australian Air Force since 1988. I've been in the Australian Air Force since 1988, and I've done a number of rescue missions with the Air Force as well. We, for a number of years, had one of our trauma registrar positions at the Royal Adelaide. It was filled by Army, Navy or Air Force on a rotation. That happened for about 5 or 6 years in a row in a 3-month period to give people some experience. It's not happening at the moment, partly due to their constraints of needing to have enough people, and the fact that the operational tempo has been quite high with Afghanistan and Iraq. But it may happen again. So certainly we try and work closely together and use the same system.
Thanks very much, Bill. Unfortunately, our projection system hasn't been working today, but I'll get Bill to email me the PowerPoint slides, and we will get them put on our website or on the Facebook page, if that's okay.
I'll need to modify some of it because I can't email the clinical ones. I'll see how
yeah. Other than that, thanks for another absolutely enthralling talk, and in thanking you, have a look at the DVD from Adelaide Rotary, and if I write some script out. Thank you.